In this video, you will see an explanation using the base block model to multiply 300 times 5, and you'll see an explanation of how to multiply negative 300 times 5. But there's two more variations you'll see on this problem that I do not show in the following video. So I thought before the video begins I'd show you the rules for multiplying signed numbers. It turns out that if you're multiplying two numbers and the signs are the same, they're the same signs, your answer will be positive. If the numbers have different signs, then the answer will be negative. So the first thing I do in the video is multiply positive 300 times positive 5, and I show that the result is 1,500. You'll have to watch the video to see how that plays out. But you should know from the beginning, since the signs were the same, they're both positive, that the answer should be a positive number. The second part of the video will show how to multiply negative 300 times 5. But you should note that since the first number is negative and the second positive, that means they have different signs, and you'll see in the video that the answer, instead of coming out positive 1,500, that the answer comes out negative. So it would be negative 1,500. There's two more variations on this problem that aren't covered in the video, and that would be if you had, say, positive 300 times negative 5, which is a variation on this one where I just switched the signs. Instead of the first being negative, the second positive, I changed it so the first is positive and the second one's negative. But nonetheless, the fact that one's positive and one's negative means that since they have different signs, the answer will come out negative. And it turns out the rest of the problem is just found by multiplying their absolute values. In absolute value, the numbers would be 300 and then the number 5, and we've already found that to be 1,500. So the problem does end up involving 1,500. It's just that it is negative in this case because the signs were different. The last variation of the problem is that if you had both of the numbers being negative, and if they were both negative, it would still be that they have the same signs, just like we had in this case. So the answer would come out to be positive. But if you looked at the product of these two numbers after you took absolute values, the absolute value of negative 300 is 300. The absolute value of negative 5 is positive 5. So if you were to multiply these two numbers after taking the absolute value, you'd get 1,500. And it turns out that would be the final answer because the signs on the two numbers were the same. And whenever you multiply two numbers where they have the same signs, the answer always comes out to be positive. Now let's show this using the base block model. In this video, I'd like to use a base block model to multiply 300 times 5. You have a choice of making 300 copies of 5, or you can make 5 copies of 300. I don't think you want to watch a video where I make 300 copies of 5, so instead I will make 5 copies of 300. Oftentimes you'll see me using a flat that looks like this that has 100 units in it. So one flat is 100 units. However, since this object is difficult to draw, I'd like to show you how you could do the problem by just drawing one big square rather than 100 units, so that it'd be easy to draw, and it would work as long as you know that this big square represents a flat or 100 units. Since I want 300 units and each one of these is 100 units, I will need 3 of these squares. So on your paper you could draw 3 squares on top of one another. That would be 1, 2 squares. One more would be 3. So this would represent 1, 2, 3 flats or 300 units, and now I need to make 5 copies of that. So this would be 1 copy, this would be 2 copies, 3 copies, 4 copies, and finally 5 copies. So to summarize, this is 1, 2, 3 flats or 300 units, and I made 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 copies of it. So I have 5 copies of 300. That would be 300 plus 300 plus 300 plus 300 plus 300 more. If you add 300 5 times, that's the equivalent of making 5 copies of 300. And if you did that, you would get 3, 6, 9, 12, 1,500 or 1,500. So 300 times 5 is equal to 1,500. In a similar way, if I wanted to multiply the number negative 300 times 5, you could think of this as that the negative here just means that we want the opposite of the previous situation where we had 300 times 5. So it's very important that you watch the first part of the video where I showed how to multiply 300 times 5. And we came out with the fact that if you multiplied 300 times 5, that indeed came out to be 1,500. So if we want the opposite of 300 times 5, that would be equivalent to finding the opposite of 1,500. And the opposite of 1,500 would be negative 1,500. So you can see that multiplying negative 300 times 5 is very similar to multiplying 300 times 5. You start by multiplying 300 times 5, and then the negative just means to do the opposite of that answer. And since that answer was 1,500, the opposite of that answer would be negative 1,500.